I wanted to discuss a bit about volumetric lighting and flat painting, about what it represents, what it means, and what artists and painters are doing to improve, change, and create drama in our pieces of miniature painting. I'm Khan, and you're watching The Wrath of Minis. Have you ever looked at miniature painting and realized that there's different styles out there? When you look at their minis or other people's minis, or even yours, why it is that some look better, some look worse, and what it is that artists or people are doing that makes their miniature look the way that it looks. When we start out, generally as a beginner painter, we are painting what is the model. We think, we're going to paint this armor, we're going to paint it red. We're going to paint this chainmail piece, we're going to paint it silver. We block the colors. And that makes sense. That's a perfectly acceptable starting point for when we get going. We're like, oh, okay, this is this material, let's paint it in this color. Eventually, however, we begin to change. We begin to see the world differently, and we begin to maybe perhaps push ourselves. We're trying to adjust our own style to improve step by step. And so this leads to a sort of conversation about these two distinct, but yet somewhat synonymous and interconnected ideas. So what are these two distinct styles? Well, let's start with flat painting. Flat painting, again, is a sort of beginner start point for so many painters out there. But it's a perfectly acceptable way of painting. And obviously anything to high standards is obviously going to be still high standards. But what is it exactly? Flat painting is painting an object or a miniature devoid of any concept of light source. So it's going to have, in its basic form, less gradients kicking around. It's going to be more flat in its textures and in its style that is being done. It's going to be more specifically blocking out the individual parts of something, obviously giving it distinction from one material to another, but there is less gradient being shifted along. So it is effectively devoid of an environment. Classically, in miniature painting, especially old original Games Workshop style painting, it is absolutely done in this flat painting style. Things are in their bold block color form. There is a lack of gradient anywhere, and it gives a visually clean, distinct pop, kind of feel, but it doesn't have any sense of environment. So why might you choose this style? Well, flat painting style is a whole lot simpler to do, and it doesn't take nearly as much understanding in terms of creating volumes. And in terms of volumes means you're creating gradients. Learning to do gradients takes a bit of practice and time. Whereas this, say if you're producing an army or doing lots of troops, it's much simpler for you to acquire and to be able to do because you're not having to deal with gradients. Flat painting style also can be very clean, very straightforward, and can be a great way of painting an army because there are going to be so many of them. It's more about the force rather than the individual model. And it is a perfectly valid, style of painting. Some people might prefer it that way just because it's more visually distinct in terms of what it looks like from when you're a distance from a model rather than being up close and looking at it, say, for, high-level artistic painting and stuff like that. It's not necessarily a lesser value than, say, volumetric. It is just a different style. And it can be done to an extraordinarily high level, depending on how far you wish to push it. As long as you keep it clean and you keep it, concise and defining all the details, people have been able to do competition level stuff with just a sort of flat painting technique. I started out when I got back into the hobby in a flat painting style, which is this Terminator right here. Intrinsically, I knew what to do with it. That's how I was going to paint the model. But as I had painted this and I have sort of gone along my journey, I have actually moved away from this style entirely. And now I predominantly or only work in sort of volumetric lighting, or that idea of shapes. And so my more recent stuff showcases that type of thing. For me, it's much more interesting. There's much more that one is playing with in terms of light, the volumes of shapes, and what one is trying to achieve. So obviously it's a much more complicated place, but once you sort of get in there and you start finding it out, it's very hard to kind of step backwards from it because of all the things that you're able to do and all the advanced concepts that come after beginning this sense of volume painting. Volumetric painting is really just a straightforward idea. It is the concept of an object and light and how those two interact with each other. Magic. We have a ball here, and I have light from this source coming down, shining on this ball. Right here is going to be its brightest spot, directly towards where the light is. And on this side, it's going to be dark. Naturally, we have a type of gradient that exists where it's going to be brighter here and darker here. And this is the thing that we are mainly working with when you're dealing with volumetric lighting. It's about shapes and about how shapes take light. So if it was a cylinder, for instance, and it was lengthwise, say like my arm, then it's going to be bright here and shadow here. I happen to have another light behind me, which is also creating another light, but I have a dark line right here. And so if I was to paint that volume, I'd be painting down the lengthwise of this in a brighter color, and then here, and if there was no light behind me, in shadow. As well, just as, the light here, my face. I've got light shining here and darkness being applied to this, or shadow. And so it's just that concept, just that idea that we are now applying to everything as we paint. My power of light switching is not as good as I would like it to be, truthfully. Why pick volumetric painting? The idea behind it is the most realistic interpretation of what we do as painters to as what is real life. But within it, we are creating more drama, more scene, we're creating shadows, we're creating dynamics. And this place that we're in is where the pros hang out. This is where the artists, the painters who are pushing us to the furthest direction are taking life around us and applying it to our miniature. Yes, they may be dramatizing it. Yes, they might be accentuating things in ways that aren't real, but the concept behind it is the same thing. And so once you start looking at things in this kind of nature, this kind of way, it's difficult to turn your eyes off it. You look at flat paint and you go, okay, I see that. But once you start seeing how volumes work, especially in real life, you're going to start seeing it everywhere, especially when you're looking on the likes of like Instagram and different, miniatures that are out there. You can start to spot how people are approaching their painting style. One of the things about being in real life is that we are always in a scene. We're always in a place where light shines upon us in a certain way or on objects. And so when we paint models in this way, we are creating a scene where light is coming from. Like perhaps it's on the battlefield and the sun is at its zenith. And so everything is bright above us, but shadow behind us. And so with these thoughts and these concepts, we are creating environment with light. Another thing about this kind of light concept as well is our eyes naturally get focused towards the brightest spots in places, especially when it comes to miniatures. Obviously, it's faces. Professional painters paint faces brighter generally than the rest of the model to a degree because our eyes get naturally drawn to those locations. So we create gradient and that drama by creating bright light here and creating this drama shadow elsewhere. So there's lots of cool things you can do with it. Very interesting stuff. And it also opens up a whole realm of other things because let's talk about object source lighting. What if there's multiple sources of light? Then it gets like, whoa, okay, that gets complicated. Or even non-metallic metal. Yes, you can paint non-metallic metal, or true metallic metal for that matter, without thinking about light. But it changes it dramatically when you do begin to think about light and how light interacts with metal, creating very shiny parts to places that are effectively, black. That whole general concept changes the entire nature of how one paints. So much of art, especially when it comes to paintings, is based upon light. The greatest artists throughout history rely and tell a story through the sense of what light is and how it plays upon a scene. And so in that sense, we as miniature painters, if we choose to, can do the same thing. We're creating a scene, we're creating art. Now, we might not all want to create art. Some of us just want to play. Some of us want to paint and make art, and that's up to each one of us to do that, to make that choice. Because this topic is vast in a certain sense, it allows for much more creativity. And that creativity can in turn be a whole lot more fun to explore the concept of scene and where things are coming from and what light it is, almost telling a story in a certain way. What is it like when you're on a desert planet and the sun is setting? What colors are those that are shining upon this miniature? Or maybe it's in a cave and there's only this little light coming from these magic mushrooms. That's the power of what you can get into when it comes to the ideas of volumetric light or understanding how light works and how that applies to us. It's a wonderful place to go into. Perhaps it's best to sort of showcase a little bit, just to kind of explain or see the differences between these types of styles of painting. Firstly, here, this one, my Terminator from Space Hulk, which I painted very early on when I started painting or getting back into the hobby again, is done in a very flat painted style. I effectively just block painting everything, The skulls are gold, the ammo chambers are silver, the cables are silver, the armor is red. Nothing complicated really in that department, just as long as keeping it clean. Whereas a later one, no, not terribly far later, just later after practicing a bunch, I started working in the idea of volumes. Cylinders running down lengthwise or creating gradients. Even though this base is completely crazy and it was just me trying something out, I wanted to really test and see if I could create a sense of volume and lighting and how it would affect a model. Now, I've moved further on than this, which now I'm able to do more things by helping create a scene, by defining what colors are around. But just learning to paint volumes is an extraordinarily important aspect of it. I feel like this model is so much more dramatic or dynamic. I don't mean its pose necessarily, but just how the lighting looks upon it rather than this one. These two ideas don't live in isolation from each other. One's just a slightly more advanced variant of another. And you can see flat painting style that has gradients in it. And so the way that you paint is up to you. That's your interpretation of what you like and what you want to achieve. Knowing, though, is half the battle when it comes to painting. Sure, there is a technical proficient skill that we are gaining whilst painting, but we also need to know what it is that we are trying to achieve mentally before we can actually pull it off technically. And so knowing that these two main ideas are the sort of core root structure of how we paint is important, I think, because regardless of which style that you personally choose, what you choose to add to it or makes it your own. It doesn't stop you from painting damages or going grimdark and making it all battle worn. It doesn't stop you from trying to do an OSL, even if you're doing flat painting. It doesn't mean that you can't add textures and details because you're pigeonholing yourself to a certain direction or style. These are just concepts, and the concepts are for us to do with what we want to do. Part of the fun of being a painter or an artist is the exploration, the journey, and having fun with what you are creating. And so there's no right or wrong about which path that you take. It's not even that it's a path between the two. It can be which way that you choose that you want it to be. And part of this is allowing yourself to innovate and have fun and create your own work that is inherently you. You don't need to think about it specifically like that. It's just that you need to go out there, paint, and then have fun in that process and allow that journey to take place. And you never know. You might find that you venture more into the painting realm rather than being a wargamer per se. You may find that you want to stay more towards the wargaming side and you want to be able to pull off quick, clean, straightforward paint jobs rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of gradients everywhere. This is your choice. This is your place. But just know these major pillars of how we paint affects the way that we interpret, see, and experience As my personal journey continues, I've definitely fallen into the volumetric painting style. The artists that I like, the art that I get drawn to, I realize falls into that sort of area. And so that's the place that I'm mostly going to be showing you guys what and how to be creating and doing. You can take those lessons though, however, and apply them to a flat painting style if you want to. There is no right and wrong between these two things. It's just about finding your own way through that path. And so yeah, I think that's really about it. Hopefully that was helpful. I gave you a good sense about the direction, about what kind of style painting that you want to be creating. Also, perhaps just visually being more aware of this thing by seeing other people's painting, but also seeing it in real life. It's funny, there are so many times that I talk to Brianna about how light falls at a certain place. And I'm like, oh, look how cool that is. And it's strange because that's something that has grown from painting and trying to replicate things like that along my journey. So you can find that there's all these things sort of like are interrelated and just all around us all the time. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. If it was, please, press the like button, subscribe. I'm signing out. Until the next time.